Richard and Alejandro with me. How's it going, guys?
Oh, well, thank
Very
you.
good, thanks.
Very good. I think we're becoming the regular kind of cast for Thursdays. We should spin off into our own podcast and leave this ARC UK stuff all behind, you know. No, I'm kidding. Uh, Today we're doing another piece looking at the Gaza and death toll numbers as reported by the Hamas-run health ministry and also the government something office. It'll come back up. It's escaping me now. We previously looked at a piece that was published in Tablet magazine by Abraham Weiner, a data statistician, hard word to say. This piece has been published by the Washington Institute and is really interesting, partly because it's actually primarily focusing on the period after Gabriel Weiner was looking at. He was looking at reporting in the first months of the war. This is looking at later on. And I think it's really interesting. And I have a couple of things to say about it. I am slightly out of my depth with statistics, so we might lean on Alejandro a bit as the professional economist in the room. But just before we dive in, any first comments from you guys, general impressions? Alejandro, we can start with you maybe. I think you muted Alejandro, maybe.
Sorry. I think, first of all and foremost, the main issue that we should think about is rather than this is just one of the qualities of Hamas or one of its characteristics, rather than something that should be useful to see the morality of this war. I think regardless of how many deaths there are, any deaths should be attributed to Hamas. If they hadn't started what they started in October 7th, nothing would be happening today, and that cannot be avoided. Deaths can be much higher than what it's reported. They can be much lower. But certainly what we must be taking a look at now is just one of the several ways in which you should be distrusting of what the Palestinian authorities is telling.
Yeah. Mark and Richard?
This kind of analysis, you're not going to find many people talking about this, because to talk about this means to watch and look objectively what's happening, not only in terms of statistics, standard deviation, all this kind of stuff, but also correlating the data with what happens on the ground. So you'll see a certain correlation between numbers going up related to what happens actually on the ground, which is the whole point of being objective. You observe reality and then you talk about it based on actual facts. Now, to chime on what Alejandro was talking about, let's set the scene here. The people of Gaza have got a government, and it's Hamas. Hamas has been voted by them, is still supported by them, and they caused the attack on Israel on October 7th, one of many attacks. This attack was particularly bad. So Israel responded trying to once and for all eliminate the threat which Hamas represent, an existential threat that Hamas is. Every single death, as Orlando said, is caused by Hamas. So it's irrelevant whether the number is correct or wrong in the absolute sense. Every single death is being caused by Hamas and its action and the action of people of Gaza who took part in this action. Let's not forget that despite the sadness of reporting the death of any human being, let's not forget that the number is irrelevant here, because there is only a reason why these people are still dying, and the reason is Hamas. They could stop the death. They could have stopped the bloodshed straight away. They chose not to do it. So every single death is on the head.
I wanted to make my opening remarks based on an answer that Ayn Rand gives in a Q&A at some point, where she says that if you conclude that someone is irrational, you don't need to study all of their evils. It might be useful for your own information or to clarify your own convictions. But if they're irrational, particularly if it's got a deeply mystic base, they've already abandoned reason. And so the point here in analyzing these numbers is not that they're made up by an irrational group necessarily. It's the fact that the Western media and people here in all sorts of bodies in the rest of the world slavishly report them as though they were fact. It's the second set of mistakes which is more relevant than the first. And then the question is, why do they slavishly report those figures and not question them so much? To which I would propose that the answer is both pragmatism and altruism tied up together, those two twin evils, which explain why that's the case. But it's all part of Hamas's irrational base to promote the propaganda that they're promoting in terms of their aim, which is to wipe out Jews as stated in their charter in the first place. So none of that comes as a particular surprise when we're looking at why these numbers exist.
Yes, I think if anyone were looking at these numbers and then concluded that Hamas was dishonorable, I'd say you've probably had your fingers in your ears for the past few months. Certainly, you know that from October 7th. And as you say, Richard, you know that from the whole nature of their existence and from their founding documents. So the point isn't that, look, we've discovered that Hamas are rotters, because they already are. And the focus is the numbers are a big plank, if you like, in the platform of the media attack on Israel. And as you say, Alejandro, the numbers could be much higher. But what this really goes to is the problem that the media is reporting these as if they're really solid. Now, one of the things the article mentions is that in a sense, there's a bit of leeway for error. Now, that might happen anyway, but particularly in a wartime, it's not like it's easy to track these kind of things. But the kind of errors that we're seeing and that we saw in Abraham Weiner's article and that we're seeing here actually go beyond errors. They're pretty much making this up. So, I mean, that's all I have to say there. So, Alejandro, one of the first things that the article is talking about are the two differing methodologies and the two organizations that are reporting it, the Gaza-run Health Ministry and the Government Media Office. Do you want to just tell people a little bit about the methodologies that are using, in effect, where these numbers are coming from?
Yes. First of all, I mean, when I start studying this a couple of weeks ago, when I went through the report that you mentioned that we did, Rassi and Daniel back in the day did show on, I tried to Google a bit on why there is some confidence on these figures and these numbers, especially from the media. And one of the things that they were saying is that in the past, there haven't been large discrepancies. And that is because discrepancies between the figures that Hamas or the Gaza Ministry of Health reports and the figures that are ultimately counted. There is no discrepancy between those two numbers. And that is because there is a counting system where whenever someone shows up dead or dies in a hospital, it's counted by medical officers rather than the army. And essentially, this is one of the reasons why there is some alleged credibility on the data. As we analyzed before, still there's some issues over there. But what we're going to discuss today is that apparently this methodology has been withdrawn, mainly because it has been withdrawn in certain areas, and that is because there is low capability of the medical officers to be there, and therefore one of the ways that they supply the data from that is essentially from media reports. That is, if Al Jazeera reports 500 dead and half of them are children, then the Gaza ministry says, okay, let's count them all. Now, one of the interesting things about this analysis is that you see how they try to compare the media reports with the reported data of the ministry. And surprise, surprise, the media reports are overblown, and not only overblown, they're over-biased to count children and women from there. It's outstanding. Like some figures say that about 70% of deaths are women and children. Were men? Are they hiding? Or they well, probably yes, in tunnels, but I think not all of them must be in tunnels. Are they, like, you know, are they hanging a pole on the top of the buildings? What's happening? It could be that. I would be certain. It's certainly true that Hamas would be capable of doing such a thing, but it's also possible that what they are doing is overcounting children, women, just by relying them in the figures reported by the media.
Yes, and one of the things discussed, as you say, is the number of women and children. And the figure that seems to be often floated around about that is that it's 72% of the fatalities are women and children. And, you know, we've been talking a lot in recent days about framing. And if you think about why is it so often stressed that they're women and children, particularly now that that figure doesn't seem to be credible in any way? Well, women and children pluck on the heartstrings, don't they? And probably you want to think about, it's not exactly like women are never involved in warfare, but the idea of reporting such a high figure of women and children is again to go to the idea that, look, the Israelis are being really brutal. They're in effect monsters here who are wanting to kill the innocent, the defenseless, and so on. And so I think that figure is very much feeding into that narrative, and that's what's going on here. Marco and Richard, did you have any thoughts about the methodology?
Yes, but bearing in mind that counting the number of victims during a military assault in a military operation on the ground is an incredible task. It's virtually impossible when the infrastructure and the people on the ground are either displaced or destroyed, or they're not there at all. Just bear in mind how difficult it is. Take a situation like a natural disaster like the Moroccan earthquake last September. It took about a couple of weeks for numerous people working full-time 24/7 trying to find survivors and rescue and recover the bodies. They took about 3 weeks. Now in that situation, you have thousands of people from all over the world converging on the place and counting the bodies and rescuing and whatever. Now, are you really telling me that Hamas, a broken government, you know, they are crooks at best of times, but during operation, when they're running away, when they're hiding, are you really telling me that they're actually able to count how many victims there are on the ground? This is absolutely impossible to even consider as possible. And also there are other factors, like Leandro said, there are lots of fighters hiding in the tunnels. Lots of fighters are actually in civilian clothing. So once you find the body, how can you tell if it's a civilian or actually an Hamas active military terrorist? And then the fact that these kind of terrorists embed their military assets in civilian areas in itself is designed to increase the number of casualty or civilian casualty. Even the fact that you're going to see a picture of a school, even if nobody dies, the propaganda news out there is they're hitting a school. They hit a school. It doesn't matter if the school contained lots of weapons and no civilians. The news is they hit the school. And this whole thing is designed to, as you said, pull the heartstring of people out there and trying to skew their view of the whole, obliterate what the real issue is, and trying to use emotionalism in order to obfuscate the issue. And you know, when we see media report of this, you see the picture of the kid in the rubble, you see a woman crying. You know, it's quite obvious. You know, you see exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I think the reporting is led by the pictures, which are also either supplied by Hamas or supplied to journalists under the careful surveillance of Hamas from Gaza. So the picture of the kid or the woman in the rubble, which absolutely dominates the coverage, and you virtually see no men involved ever, as if they simply don't exist at all. And then the statistic is added to the report for the illusion of credibility, to balance out the emotionalism with what is perceived as a fact, because it is a number, and a number is a number. But it's the the source of that number that is relevant here. And I think this speaks a lot to how reason has been left only to like the sciences, and already it's diminishing in many ways in the sciences. But the humanities and reporting and those kind of fields tend to want to borrow something which is numerical to give credence to what they're saying otherwise in words. And they don't actually care how that number is derived, just that it gives the illusion of authenticity to the report. I mean, you see that all the time in terms of polling and surveys, in terms of modeling, whether it's for climate change or for COVID, figures or whatever. All of that is the technique used here, and simply adding things like this number is, from the Hamas Ministry of Health, for example, as a stock phrase, doesn't discharge the responsibility for making an attempt to properly verify it, or if you cannot do so, not to report the number, full stop, because it's just plucked out the air otherwise, and it can't be relied upon. And obviously, when the numbers are supplied by Israel, I hear repeatedly cannot be independently verified is the stock phrase used for them. Never cannot be independently verified is used on the Hamas side. It's always the Ministry of Health, which again gives it an illusion of credibility, as if it comes from an official body. Well, really, that's the Ministry of Death propaganda.
Yes, and so when it's talking about the methodology that's being used by the Ministry of Health, it's saying that and by the way, I think we'll put a link to this in the description and maybe in the live chat, just so that people can have a look at this themselves. It's actually fairly comprehensively written. If I can read this and get a good impression of it, I don't think it's outside of anyone else's grasp either. But so then from the end of November or thereabouts, I believe it was saying, before that, it was taking figures from hospitals and morgues. But then as these places were increasingly evacuated, after that, it basically stopped using those, and because it became impracticable to do so for the most part, and was relying on media reports, as you guys have said. And it's saying that it's using reliable media reports. Now, one of the things the article is saying is that's not wholly uncommon to do that kind of thing, but it's a notoriously very difficult thing to do in any way that's objective. And one of the potential implications, which the article didn't make, but which occurred to me, is that depending on the sources that they're using, if the media is reporting on the numbers and then the Gaza Health Ministry is getting their numbers from the media, it's almost like just a feedback loop where it's a circle going round and round. Now, since he doesn't make that point, maybe that's not a valid way to think about it, but that was one of the things that occurred to me. And as for the Israeli numbers as well, I think we should just say to people that the point about counting numbers in war, which is very difficult, which you mentioned, Marco, even the Israeli numbers, I think, are quite liable to have problems in the accuracy. And I think the Israeli sources are going to be more reliable because I do think they're an honorable source compared to the Hamas-run health ministry, for example. But that doesn't mean they're axiomatically going to be right. So the numbers are liable to shift, but the key point is that the Hamas numbers, whereas the Israeli numbers might have a claim to validity, these numbers have no claim to validity at all. Even I think in a sense as a range, if you were taking the Israeli numbers as the lower end and the Gaza-run health ministry as the upper end, I don't even think you're able to do that anymore, really. And Alejandro, just coming back to you, what did you make of this article in terms of its methodology as well? Because again, you're a bit more of a professional on this. Did you see this and think this guy's really done the kind of boot and spade hard work?
I do. I think as well the other article that we discussed in the past was a bit more, was scratching a bit more the surface on the statistical inconsistencies within the same data. So, for instance, it analyzed how sometimes whenever a children is reported death, no men are reported death, things like that. Here, I think the analysis goes more towards, hey, you're using two different methodologies, and one of those is really weird. And as well, in the past, you were relying on the UN's OCHA, which means the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which more or less gave some credibility, and some people that weren't completely Hamas corroborating some of the results. But now you don't even have this, and I think to that extent, what this article is doing rather is taking a look at the methodology, and which is actually the main source of the supposed credibility of these numbers. And I think another feature of this article is that it relies and publishes the database, which is also quite useful. One of the things that you can see if you download the Excel file is that sometimes, some days, about 50% of the data or the numbers are coming solely from the media reports, which is quite odd, and it's as well quite volatile, which is something that I would not have expected if there was some stability. It's not to say that they are false, but certainly it raises suspicions.
For sure. Okay, and so then moving on to the next part of the article, I guess. How to put this? I was going to say, and this is sticking with you, Alejandro. If there were to be objectivity in this reporting, how would be the way that someone should be doing this? Like, what kind of methodology? Like, what could you come to a plausible or valid number of the deaths, or do we just have to wait in a sense until the war is finished?
I would say that if you wanted to have any credibility, you would at least have 2 data points, something like that says this is what we are counting so far, and these are corroborated killings, and you can see them by this identification figures, and also the corroboration of the data can be done by anyone that wishes to do so, and there must be ways to identify if people are really dead. That's a really gruesome task, but I think that if people want to see the data, they should be provided. If you really want to have reliability, so yeah, that's what I would attempt to see. Yet, the only thing that I've seen so far is an article of the Times, which maybe we can discuss it later. But essentially, one of the things that it says is, well, we got a list of 218 deaths with their IDs, but we couldn't verify them. But still, we're counting it for good. And I think that's really bad. Like, how do you know that they're not like a list of people going to school and they're just counting it as death, right?
Marco and Richard, what other thoughts did you have about the article?
Well, I think in terms of just what Alejandro was saying there about inconsistencies and stuff within the data set, I think one thing is inconsistencies within the data set, which is certainly relevant for exposing its flaws. Also, a ludicrous consistency is equally relevant for exposing flaws. If it sits rigidly at 72%, for example, because the 72% has been predetermined as the ideal number that sounds high, but not too high to be plausible, and therefore gives the outcome desired when it comes to claiming, that more women and children have died, then obviously, that's equally a cause for concern and a red flag. The lag that is necessary for accurate data. So, for example, when the hospital that was supposedly attacked by rocket, and suddenly within moments they've got a number of 500 dead, even though all of the facts change subsequently. That's kind of the proof of some of the lies which are evidenced by just implausible, implausible way in which they're derived at, for example, as well as the corpses that sit up midway through a press conference, or the corpses that are revealed to be dolls by a hand that sticks out the end of a piece of cloth, for example. All of those things are physical evidence, because what you're really looking at here, and what Alejandro is referring to by the grim task of checking the dead, is the correspondence to truth, the correspondence to reality. And this is what I was saying earlier on, is that numbers become very separated from reality and seem to exist in their own orbit. And then, of course, their compound effect of building lies, based on those numbers, in order to keep them going up, in a particular trajectory, or to derive policy from them, or to derive an attitude in the West to them. All of that comes out of the fact that these numbers aren't verified in truth, in reality.
Yeah, and the article makes the point that if you use the data which is bandied about in order to write an article, you should actually be open and clear about it. Say where the data come from, explain what methodology has been used, and even as the author of the article does, show us the data sets they use. What are the data that you use to try and interpret the events? And that could go towards a sort of openness and trustworthiness, but at the same time exposes all the flaws that the data contain. If you do the comparison and the kind of behavior of the data sets, you see all sorts of oddities. You see that some people suddenly come back to life, and you see that the proportion don't make lots of sense, because yes, there's 50% of the population in Gaza are children. Also depends on how you define children anyway. But 50% are children, a quarter women, a quarter adult males. Now, you would expect to see some sort of relationship between the number of deaths on the ground and the events on the ground. So if people are moved away from an area, you would expect the number of casualties in the area to be fewer. And also the way that the surgical striking that Israel is disgracefully trying to obtain itself should give you an example. Okay, if you match the event with the data that's been provided, you should find some kind of correlation, but this thing doesn't seem to be there. And of course, as Ariando mentioned, once an area is depopulated, or a place or an hospital and the staff in the hospital are removed, the data becomes less and less reliant. So all these caveats, which are actually in the article, should be borne in mind by whoever uses the data. But the point is that the media are trying to hold up the side of Hamas against Israel. So it's quite obvious. If you want to be open about the data, you show me the data. The data are there. These are the data sets that we used, and work it out yourself if you don't trust us. But they're not going to do that. A big number sells more than a small number. That's what it boils down to.
Now, one of the points from the previous article we looked at by Abraham Weiner was, if I'm remembering it correctly, was that there was a kind of linear progression of deaths across all the reporting, and that was something to distrust. And I suppose that goes to what you were saying, Richard, about a ludicrous kind of consistency. Now, there's a point. So the way the article is structured at the end, Gabriel Epstein, the writer, makes a number of recommendations and caveats in terms of key takeaways for people. And one of the things he says, I'll just read it out. One of the key recommendations is data from both methodologies suggest that the war has decreased in intensity. Fatalities have declined from an average of 348 per day in the first weeks of the war to around 85 per day in March. Now, I wanted to hear what you guys made of that, because in a sense, in terms of the numbers, and of course he is recommending and saying that these numbers are invalid, but that would make a certain kind of sense in a way, because what we've seen are the Israelis pulling their punches. And so what do you guys make of that, in the sense that the numbers have decreased? Is there anything to that which might speak in favor of the numbers? Perhaps not. But Alejandro, what did you think about that point?
I think to that extent, it sounds consistent with what has been happening. We know that the most violent, I mean, with most strikes days in the war were back in November, and I think I would tend to see that there is some consistency. I even watched the BBC reporting on the issue, and they even have like they have the chart that looks like a wave, like a logarithmic wave, and there is a period when you see the truce back in before December, and you see that there's a flat line over there, and I think to that extent there is consistency. However, if you bring up the fact that there are two methodologies into the question, then you can certainly, what you can do is you can rely on the more credible one, and then when you need to inflate the numbers, you can bring the other one, and that what it only does is you can inflate the numbers quite easily while being consistent with what is happening. So yeah,
sure. And I should say we have a super chat from Ginger Clark for $10. Thank you very much, Ginger. And Daniel mentions, going to your point, Marco, that about children, that the way that children are defined is anyone under 18. Now, that's a bit of a strange definition in a way, because when I think the death of children is being reported, I think what's coming to people's mind are people, in a sense, who are under 10, who are, very young, very small. And if it's teenagers, I would still, that still plucks at my heartstrings. But that, I think, starts conflating in people who are actually real combatants as well alongside that. And unfortunately, it mentions in the article that Hamas has used child soldiers in the past, which doesn't mean it's not tragic if they get killed because they've had a gun shoved into their hand and are pushed into the line of fire. But the implication as well then from any of those who are in there is that they're counted as part of this brutality narrative that's being established. And again, to Hamas's dishonor, we know that they model themselves on or take inspiration from the Iranian regime, who very much would march children into minefields in order to explode mines. So children do get dragged into the combat, not just as a collateral issue, but are directly put into the line of fire by these organizations and groups. Mark and Richard, what?
Sorry, there's plenty of footage of the Hamas training camps for children very young, armed training camps, showing how they're clearly trained as soldiers from very young. So, and that's even towards the 10, 12 age range, let alone the for sure they're not in universities and high education come 16 or come 15 in this particular scenario. They're being used as combatants, as you say. I think when the point about the war decreasing in intensity, that would run absolutely against the impression that everybody else is being given around the world, wouldn't it? If you went anywhere and said, has the war in Gaza become less intense since the start of this year, for example, you would certainly not get that response. And that's the point, isn't it? And the point is that together with the photographs used as an argument, together with the numbers that are provided, when they switch the source and used to take the higher ones or simply to invent them, the intention is to make it seem as if things are getting critical, too intense, and far worse. And of course, it doesn't recognize the reality of the fact that the earlier campaign would involve more airstrikes, and then the later campaign involves more, specific targeted ground operations, and is much slower and more progressive. Moves at a slower pace from that point of view. So all of those obvious facts become detached again from the numbers, and people have to pull back and think, hang on a minute, what is likely to be true before I even see any numbers? And therefore, does that apply? Does that match with the truth that number is, claiming?
And of course, it's consistent to the ground operation to assume that the number of Hamas terrorists killed by the IDF will go up at the same time as the civilians' collateral damage come down, because, as Richard said, you start with the airstrike, which is hitting targets which are likely to be surrounded with civilians, because it's Hamas policy. Let's not forget that at the beginning of the strikes, Hamas government actively was telling people to ignore the warning from Israel and stay put, because they wanted martyrs. That's the technique. So if you only could separate the number of fighters versus civilians, you actually see the number of fighters killed by Israel is going up and the civilian come down. But you can't do the kind of decision, as I said before, in total disregard of international law. These guys are hiding in civilian facilities and they are dressed in civilian clothing. So you can't even do that kind of distinction. The data set, let's remind people that a media report is likely done by an Al Jazeera media organization or a BBC media organization. The Owen Jones of this land are there by helping their friends in Hamas. So can you really rely on this kind of stuff? I'm skeptical about the whole thing.
And look at the numbers that aren't provided as well, the very, very limited numbers that could easily be provided. Which hostages are alive? How many are dead? That's not provided. It doesn't want to be provided. And that serves a propaganda purpose as well, because that allows for negotiations with human lives as currency.
For sure. And so then moving to, unless you guys have anything else to say about the piece, you can circle back around after I've just said this, but in terms of the media response, because again, the context for the numbers is that they're very widely reported, at face value, and they aren't interrogated by any real media source that I've seen. And certainly, even if there are dedicated pieces, which I've missed, which I certainly have missed if they are, even if they were being reported in the kind of as a sideline or as part of another article, there would certainly need to be a lot of discussion put in there about explaining why they think these numbers are credible. And when we looked at the Cenk Uygur interview or debate, if you want to say that, on Piers Morgan kind of came back at Rabbi Shmuley by saying, excuse me, these numbers are reported by trusted sources. And trusted is doing a lot of work there, isn't it? Because in a sense, there is such a thing as authority, which I think you can use, or expertise, which you can use in making an inference or making a judgment about reliability. There's a fair context or circumstances where you can factor that in. But if what trusted means is they're reporting it blank, just at face value, then what is that even a proper way to do it? I don't think so. And so thinking about how the media talks about this, then, do you guys think we're going to see a change in how they treat these numbers, given that these kind of publications? It's a bit of a softball question, I know, but do you think there'll be a change? Because as we say, in a sense, these numbers should have never been trusted anyway. You don't even really need these pieces to really make a judgment about the reliability of Hamas. However, given that this pretty solid work has been done, are we going to see a change coming around? Alejandro, what do you think?
I don't think there is going to be a change. And that brings me to the article of the Times that I was mentioning. This is from October 27th, back in the day when Biden was saying that he didn't fully trust Hamas's, the Gaza Health Ministry's death toll. And as I mentioned, there was a release of some identification of some people. Back in the day, they were saying that they were 7,000 people, but they released less than 1,000 IDs. So that brings to the question, why didn't they release the IDs of the other 6,000 people? But what I wanted to bring up is the article brings up the question: are the numbers reliable? And they ask two people, three people in reality. One that it's supposedly in favor of Israel, that says, yes, there is an incentive to inflate the numbers. Then they ask someone from the UN's OCHA, and they say, well, we have been able to corroborate the numbers in the past. And then they asked to someone called a journalist, Noor Odeh, and he says, after every war, a list is issued with the names, what we have discussed. So that, and essentially one of the things that she says is that brings credibility to the figures. He says, this is not done by political figures. This compilation is done by health professionals. There is a very concerted effort to that in Palestine, and unfortunately, there's a lot of practice. However, as the article continues, he finishes his statement by saying that the death toll is no different than other historical denials of ethnic cleansing. And quote, the Serbs denied that all those people being killed in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Rwanda, the same thing happened. The Russians do it in Ukraine, and they did it along with Assad regime in Syria. This is a playbook of people who commit atrocities. So what he's saying is, if you don't trust the numbers, you're just part of the ethnic cleansing thing. Like, don't bring us any question of the numbers. It's what they are, and if you are questioning, you're just part of the genocide, which is a completely scientifical, rational, any like it's simply unbearable. It's the argument of intimidation that we have discussed in the past, which is simply idiotic.
Mm. And certainly that very much is feeding into all this narrative building that we're seeing going on. But go on, Marco and Richard.
Well, just to add to what you're saying there, I think that there's two responses from different types of journalists in the West. There's in part, there's the better of them is the fact perhaps that they don't want to expose the fact that they simply do not know, and they simply have no way of knowing. And no journalist wants to say, I don't know, because you're not doing your job properly, essentially, if you're admitting that fact. And then there's the group that don't know and don't care to know and are happy to take the alternative narrative as fact and to report it as fact with a caveat they know will be ignored by sheer repetition of the same phrase. I think, secondly, there's the constant comparison with October the 7th numbers, as if it really doesn't matter so long as it's higher than October the 7th. That means, therefore, if on a mathematical basis, that Israel is in the wrong, which dispenses with all of the morality of self-defense and ignores all of the core issues and the essentials of the conflict, which we've spoken about many times on this channel. And then there's the health professionals that are supposed to report accurate numbers are also in large part Hamas advocates, as things like the Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday reporting of recent social media posts of Hamas doctors that were featured on the BBC have shown. They are clearly sold up to Hamas propaganda. So you cannot treat a health professional in that kind of setting as of the same kind of moral stature and honesty as you might do a group of health professionals in other Western countries when it comes to reporting numbers of deaths, for example. I think all of that's in it.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember this is a war zone. The people of Gaza who are supposed to work for the various organizations who provide these numbers are the same people that were working for UNRWA by digging tunnels under the facilities, taking money from the international community, from all of us, in order to arm Hamas. So let's not forget that this war is Israel versus Gaza. It's not just a skirmish. It's a population versus another population. Gaza wants to destroy the population in Israel. And it's the same thing that when the Argentinian invaded the Falkland Islands, it was the Argentinian that Britain was at war with temporarily in order to protect their territories. And it's the same again. It's the people in Gaza who have attacked Israel and who now pay for the consequence of the action of the government. As I said earlier on, it doesn't matter ultimately what the number of casualties are. Of course, we would prefer a smaller number, but even if the Hamas fighter keep dying, well, it's on the head. They chose that kind of life. They chose to attack Israel. They choose death at every chance, and now they're paying the consequences. So the media are selling papers and getting clicks based on big numbers. And of course, they're never going to question them, because first of all, they haven't got the intellectual power to work out what's going on. And second, they haven't got any intention whatsoever to find out the truth, because they're not in the business of selling the truth, are they? We know journalism nowadays is not what it used to be. Although there are some exceptions, largely it's about activism, political activism, making the point, giving the reason why the point you believe true is true. So, reality has left this business years ago. So there's no reason why these things should happen.
Yes, I tend so to answer my own question. My suspicion, or strong belief, is that we won't see any change in how the media is reporting these numbers. And I'd be very happy to see if that were, if I were wrong about that. But as I say, if they were reporting the numbers beforehand, then why won't they continue doing it now? We're seeing these two articles, but we're not seeing a slew of information, which is really compounding it, on a big scale. And so I suspect there won't be a change. And I mean, and just to back up the point I was making before about there are contexts where you can take authority or expertise into account, that's still where you're evaluating the source and you're evaluating it as having some real reliability. And the kind of attitude which Piers Morgan was a good representative of just saying they're trusted is an evaluation, but it's an evaluation which he's spinning out without actually having done the evaluating, if you see what I'm saying. So given that seems to be the attitude amongst the journalists who are reporting on the war, which is a real, dishonorable and shocking thing, because research skills are a big part of being a journalist, and they're really engaging in a dereliction of their duty there to their readers and to informing them properly. So I don't think we'll see a change, not at all. I think this kind of thing is going to continue. As we're approaching the final 10 minutes, guys, any other final thoughts on the article or about any wider issues?
Yes, I think one of the things that maybe we didn't state enough, and one of the core reasons why I think I don't believe in numbers, regardless of the statistical issues, is that they're stemming from the people who portray the October 7th attacks. And maybe you can say that this is the health ministry and they are more or less independent from it. I doubt it. But don't you think that in a country where essentially you're subject to obey what Hamas is saying, you don't have the incentive to portray what they want you to portray? Don't you think that in the hospitals where Hamas leadership is hiding, people, doctors over there wouldn't be having enormous pressure to inflate the numbers? I think that's the main reason why I don't rely. It's stemming from the data is coming from people who don't have any moral standing, that they know that they can twist, portray, and confuse the truth because of their political means. And as I said, the figures can be higher, they can be lower. But whatever they say, I think what they're saying is essentially within the arbitrary realm. And unless there is someone who has some credibility analyzing the numbers, I won't believe them.
The numbers, bear in mind, are based on an ideology where martyrdom and death is the goal. So if that is your aim and your highest ideal, then that's going to warrant or lead to an inflation of numbers, particularly if that in itself is designed to motivate your own side and, of course, to garner the sympathy of the rest of the world. And then I think a lot of this comes down to the epistemology of it, doesn't it? It comes down to basing your credibility on faith as opposed to reason, and having just sheer faith in the numbers, because they're numbers, and B, because you've already picked a side based on either anti-Semitism or a misunderstanding of the regional issues or a misunderstanding of the nature of the October the 7th itself. And of course, added to that, you've got all of these journalists who've seen the footage taken from the GoPros of the Hamas terrorists on October the 7th, who, even having seen that reality-based evidence, will excuse it and deny it, but will still take a separate source that contains a number that comes from Hamas as the bona fide truth. And that, again, exposes their lack of morals.
Yeah, and about the death cult going on, the kind of culture, I'd like to point people to the Al Jazeera documentary we discussed a few days ago. At the end of it, I can't remember exactly who the guy was, but he effectively admitted that it doesn't matter how many martyrs, how many people die in Gaza, because they're dying for the good cause. So they don't see death as something bad, but they just see it as something necessary in order to achieve the goal they want to achieve. Now, let's hope the Israel response doesn't stop here. Let's hope that they carry on and they achieve the goal of destroying Hamas, because you will never change these people's mind. As Richard said, it's not based on rationality. You cannot argue and show where they get it wrong, because they start from a premise of total arbitrary thinking on the religious thinking. So you cannot possibly change the culture unless you squash it totally, unless you show them how to behave, and you raise a brand new generation based on freedom and rationality. That's the only way.
And these increased numbers at no point have led to the obvious conclusion that anybody faced with all of the things that are supposedly to occur, like starvation, like mass death, of returning the hostages. At no point has the conclusion been, okay, let's reduce these numbers, let's hand back the hostages. So, I mean, that's the evidence that can't be wiped out from this whilst examining spreadsheets.
Whenever we're talking about issues with the numbers, one of the things that comes to mind, and this is going to a lot of what you guys are saying, were the factory production numbers coming out of the Soviet Union. So because, of course, the factories were given targets, and what would kind of happen with the numbers is they'd progress. And because they were very inefficient and there was a bad culture of inefficiency there, towards the end of the month, the numbers would shoot up, right? Because they needed to hit the targets. Now, why is that happening? It isn't because the people running the factory literally had a gun to their head the whole time, but they were under force. So in a broader sense, they were under the threat of that. And so the people in the Gaza health ministry, as you were saying, Alejandro, are under the threat of force. They aren't free. And so when they're reporting the numbers, someone might not literally be there with an AK-47 to their head as they're reporting them, but they're under the threat that if they displease the powers that be, then that could be lethal. And so numbers which are coming from free sources aren't axiomatically right or even valid, but you should be enormously distrustful and perhaps even discard entirely numbers which are coming from sources where their whole lives are on the line if they were to do it in a way that displeased the authorities. So I think that's something people need to keep in mind. And then as for the numbers of people dead, you were talking about this before, Richard. There was a Twitter exchange that was going on between Muin Rabbani and Destiny, who were in the Lex Friedman debate a few weeks ago. And they are getting into a spat over many things. And one of them is Destiny saying, supposedly somewhere in a video about, well, Israel could kill 2 million people and it wouldn't be a genocide. And interestingly, Rabbani just, is asked about that. And he just says, well, I think that stands for itself, in effect saying that, or speaks for itself, in effect saying that if you killed 2 million people, axiomatically, that would be a genocide. And again, that was in a debate where he was arguing over what a genocide consisted of. But genocide consists of the methodical and deliberate killing of an entire group with that intention. And whatever the number in Gaza turns out to be of people who've died, if it turns out to be much higher than 32,000 or wherever we are at the moment, it could be 200,000. That doesn't prove that the Israelis are committing genocide, as so many people are implying or outright saying. as long as what they're doing is they're acting on their right to self-defense and they're attacking military targets and people are dying in the crossfire in effect, then that completely goes against this narrative of genocide that we're seeing and which people are spouting all over the place. Okay, guys.
Also, sorry, Morgan. Ultimately, the only numbers I really care about and I really trust is the number of young IDF soldiers who have died unnecessarily because they're trying to minimize the civilian on the ground in Gaza. That's something you can rely on. That's something you can rely on, the fact that it's totally unfair and unjust.
And look at the fakeness of the numbers when it comes to the population within Gaza, even ahead of this, and of the numbers of refugees that supposedly are Palestinian. I mean, at every level, there's an inflation of the victims before the conflict even began. And of course, just to go back to my earlier point, that 2 million that you refer to there, well, why would you not hand the hostages back when you've suffered 100,000 deaths? Why would you continue to wait and wait and wait and suffer supposedly to an nth degree and never consider that you're in the wrong and therefore that you should you should give up on your evil ideology?
And I should also say we have a new YouTube member, Susan Bookman. Thank you so much. We don't make any ad revenue off these videos because they don't qualify under the YouTube regulations. So all the support we get to keep going comes directly from you guys. So if you see value in our work, please consider that. It's really appreciated. It keeps on the lamp behind me. Alejandro, any final comments?
No, thank you.
Okay, no worries. All right, well, thank you so much, guys. I think this was a really good episode. As I say, if you guys like this, please share, like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and consider becoming a member. It really helps us out. But thank you so much. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. See you later.
Bye.